Hi everyone, and welcome to your full moon forecast for the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. So in this forecast I'm going to cover the main cosmic themes that will be affecting the collective for the next 2 weeks. The reason that I'm doing that is because I have done some individual horoscopes for my subscribers on my website, so if you're interested in those, then do go and sign up at astrologysphere.com/subscribe. I've also done some more fun geomancy style forecasts on my YouTube channel, so you can also go and have a look at those. So essentially what I'm going to do in this forecast is look at the main kind of general trends from an astrological perspective, and how they stand to affect the collective, putting everything into sort of a wider context. And then I'm also going to have a look at a few trends that I think might be pertinent particularly to starseeds, so that's something to look forward to later in this particular forecast. So I thought a good way to do this is to sort of talk while I've got the chart up, so that we can, you can kind of have a look at the astrological chart itself. So as you can probably see, we've got Sagittarius rising and we've got the moon in Sagittarius in the first house. So this is a lot of fire energy, and it's interesting because the moon is not really considered to be to operate very well in the sign of Sagittarius. It's in detriment here, and I think that's because we get kind of big emotions. So there is possibly a tendency here to for things to spiral out of control, for there to be big emotions, so like hysteria, mass hysteria, to overreact, to get triggered. So I think these are things we just need to bear in mind over the next couple of weeks, so that we don't kind of head into territory where we feel a little bit out of balance. And of course, balance is what any full moon is really about. This one is trying to balance the energies of Sagittarius on one hand and Gemini on the other. So that's why we've got the moon in one sign and the sun in the other part of the zodiac. And essentially this particular pairing is about information or knowledge versus wisdom. So it's about the balance between faith and reason. And I think that's something that we've been battling with for the last couple of months, particularly around the measurement, the testing, the reporting of COVID-19, for example, and then of course around this issue in America with the issue of Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd death, and how this then gets fitted into various polemics depending on what what the intention sort of is of a political or lobbyist group, and so on. And I think the key thing to remember is that the way we make decisions is not always necessarily logical. And I think this is something that lunar phases really kind of highlight, is that very often we think we're being logical when we make a decision, but really what we're doing is we are making decisions based on emotions and beliefs, and then we're backing it up with logic. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just think it's sometimes important to be honest about how we make decisions, and then also to look at assumptions around those decisions. Are we just sort of looking for the world to confirm what we already believe, or is it maybe time to kind of go back to first principles, as someone like Elon Musk likes to say, to step away from social conditioning and assumptions that we sort of absorb, as a result of beliefs that are sort of around us, we kind of assume are true, but they may not necessarily be true. They may simply be the way that a particular culture filters information. So I think it's very important to go back to first principles, to detach a little bit from a tendency to sort of rush in and make snap judgments, and but also not to be too kind of entrenched in this position of logic is king kind of thing, because we've seen how, particularly with the COVID-19 situation, how scientific research, facts and so-called data can be manipulated to mean lots of different things, to reach different conclusions. So I think that is equally sort of problematic if we kind of go down that route too much. So essentially what's happening is we're moving from the axis of Cancer Capricorn, which is where eclipses have been for the last 18 months to 2 years, and we're now moving into the Gemini Sagittarius axis. Now, we haven't been in this Saros cycle since around about 2001, 2002. So there may be resonances now with things that happened, kind of back then. So worth, just thinking about that a little bit. Certainly from a cultural perspective, two big events that happened back then were the dot-com bubble and then crash, and then also the 9/11 sort of event, and what that kind of did in terms of the way religion became polarized, for example, how it also became politicized and weaponized. So that's something to bear in mind. And then global travel, I think also was sort of affected quite fundamentally, as was politics. I think politics since then has shifted dramatically from the so-called kind of war on terror and people just accepting what politicians said as gospel, to the post-truth politic era that we're in now, where politicians feel it's okay to just lie and just keep lying, in the hopes that eventually people will believe them, and unfortunately a lot of people do. So I think we just need to tread very, very carefully as we move through this period. The reason I say that is because the Moon and the Sun will be making a T-square to Mars in Pisces, and here Mars in Pisces can be quite subversive, so it can sort of introduce this kind of stealth element of kind of getting in the back door, and being not necessarily having, Mars, in and of itself is the planet of war and strife, so it tends to divide, it tends to generate sort of an element of I don't want to say hate, because that's too strong, but it can sort of create aggression and conflict, but in sort of quite an underhanded way, a kind of a passive aggressive or stealthy way, a sneaky way. So that's just something to be mindful of. This is Mars in its kind of covert agent, provocateur sort of mode, kind of just dropping in little hints or making subliminal suggestions that we might not necessarily pick up on consciously, but that we kind of start to absorb, and then we think is our idea, or that we sort of picking up a kind of vibe amongst the collective, and it makes people kind of start to argue with each other. It tends to make us second guess ourselves. It sows seeds of doubt. So a lot of mind games, I think, so just something to be aware of. And of course Venus will be traveling with the Sun as well, and Venus and Mars made a square to each other on the 3rd of June, so that energy will kind of carry over into this eclipse, and for sort of for the next 2 weeks, that collective energy. So it could affect relationships. It could be that on a personal level we kind of encounter people that we had romantic kind of contact with, but there was a kind of a spark, there was chemistry, but it wasn't a particularly healthy dynamic, or there was a lot of conflict, a lot of sort of clash of wills, just didn't sort of see eye to eye, and probably the relationship didn't have longevity. So with Venus being retrograde, it's possible that we could be revisiting some of those issues. Some people might try to kind of come back into our lives, or we may sort of decide, or kind of have regrets maybe about how things worked in the past, and want to sort of go back and make amends, or there's that kind of, I wonder if things could have been different if kind of vibe going on. So I do recommend that if you are in that space, that you check out my Venus retrograde video on YouTube. I did do an extended version, so members also have access to that, and I go quite in detail into the Venus-Mars square in that video. So I think that's just bearing in mind between now and the new moon solar eclipse that begins a fresh 6-month cycle for us later on in June. So this is kind of really a time of wrapping up loose ends. That's the way I tend to see full moons, and of course lunar eclipses are kind of exaggerated full moons in many ways. So on some level we are kind of putting to bed maybe some not so great patterns, have ways of thinking, and in particular ways of perceiving the world, beliefs, that type of thing. So I think it's a really good idea to just kind of, as I say, go back to first principles, to step back from assumptions and look at things with fresh eyes before we act. And here I think the Sabian symbol is quite a good place to look for hints of how to do that. So the Sabian symbol is seagulls watching a ship, and this is the 16th degree of Sagittarius. Now, the way that James Burgess, who wrote a book called 360 Degrees of Wisdom, interprets this, I think is quite interesting, actually, given that, you know, we do have the moon and the sun, which are kind of the masculine and feminine energies coming together. So he sees this as being about sort of two phases of perception, actually. So the first phase is the kind of yin phase. So this is the seagulls kind of taking in the scene, watching to see what's going on, fact-finding, so going on a recce, gathering information. But this is kind of almost raw data. So we're just sort of taking everything in. We're not judging it. We're not sorting it at this point. Then the second phase is the more yang phase. So this is kind of sorting through the information, deciding what's relevant, what isn't, what sort of dovetails with our beliefs, what doesn't. You know, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? You know, so kind of applying a filter of wisdom to the information to see whether in fact it's from good sources. Do these sources have good intentions, for example, or are they just trying to sort of like create chaos, confusion and disruption? And then finally making a decision on what to do with the information. So this is the kind of practical applying of the information to our lives and putting facts into the context of the wider picture. So this is really what Sagittarius is very good at, is kind of zooming out, getting that kind of eagle eye vision of situations and contexts, you know, looking at it from a wider perspective and then making decisions that are going to be in our highest good rather than simply kind of knee-jerk based on the latest trends or whatever the news is saying or what we see everybody doing when they kind of do knee-jerk reactions. So I think that's a good way to, you know, to sort of go now, is kind of taking a step back, assessing the information based on what else we've learned throughout the experience of our lives, you know, that kind of learned wisdom, before we then act on the information. So then the other aspect that will be happening is a trine between the moon and black moon Lilith, as well as Chiron, which are kind of orbiting through the sign of Aries at the moment. Now here it's interesting, you know, the trine in and of itself suggests that there are opportunities for healing that are likely to come up over the next 2 weeks, and these are likely to do with either family dynamics or relationship dynamics that may have kind of been affected by wounds that we sustained usually at around about the age of 12, 13, so as we kind of move into puberty. And then we add another layer, which is that Chiron and Black Moon Lilith will be making a conjunction to a fixed star called Alpha-Rats. Now, Alpha-Rats is the alpha star in the Andromeda constellation, so this may have a particular resonance with starseeds that predominantly identify with the constellation of Andromeda. Now, the way that this is interpreted by Aspen Rain, who runs a website called the Starseed Compass, is that Andromedians tend to be freedom-loving individuals. They don't really like any form of control, anything that they perceive as sort of manipulation or an attempt to sort of curtail their freedom, to kind of hold them down. Now, this could spring from the way that astrologers sort of interpret the fixed star itself, Alpha-Rats, which is associated with, you know, with freedom and movement. So, you know, if you have, as an Andromedian, had problems, you know, kind of committing to long-term relationships, and this is really kind of getting you down and you're sort of wondering why this pattern kind of keeps repeating, it may have something to do with your Andromedian origins or your Andromedian karma. So that's something that you might want to kind of look into a little bit further. Then the other sort of sort of activations that are likely to happen now are around Orion, because the Sun and Venus will be traveling through the constellation of Orion, which is sort of located within Gemini. So this is likely to activate any karmic issues left over from Orion lifetimes, and you know, the general sort of consensus there is that Orion was once a sort of a warrior culture or nation, and that it did once kind of go over to the dark side. So it could be that there are issues here around power struggles, perhaps being too much of a warrior, so tending to sort of default to conflict and aggression rather than looking for commonalities or ways to sort of work more harmoniously. So maybe just putting that soul down for a minute and considering that there may be other ways to to resolve long-term issues within relationships in particular. Of course, it could also be that at this time starseeds start to become more aware of their gifts and their talents, and that's because of a wonderful positive aspect between Mercury and Uranus that happens at this particular lunar eclipse. So this is really positive sextile energy, which is really great for learning, for kind of making progress, for looking at things in a slightly different way. So it could be now that you have a lot of insight. You feel maybe you kind of get what like people like to term downloads. So you have this sort of spell of being receptive to new ideas that kind of come in intuitively as like flashes of insight. And it could be that you are remembering information that you have acquired through other lifetimes, possibly in these constellations. So in this sense, I think it's a great 2 weeks for aha moments or realizations, suddenly seeing things differently, deciding to go down a different path, deciding to work, not to react in the same way that you have in the past, and to perhaps try a different approach when it comes to communication, for example, or simply accepting your differentness, seeing it as a strength rather than a weakness, and sometimes just being aware of that difference and why you may be not like other earthlings, I think can sometimes be enormously helpful and healing, because suddenly it's not that you're a freak or that you just can't kind of get something right. It's that you just you are a little bit different, and knowing that can help you to then navigate terrestrial life in a different way, kind of make allowances for these things, understand that the way that you view relationships, or the way that whatever you need to be happy and to function well might be slightly different to other people, and that's okay. Accepting difference, embracing difference. So those are kind of the main sort of highlights I think that I want to sort of talk about for this particular eclipse. It could be that there is a little bit of disruption sort of going on in the world stage at the moment, and that's because of where Mars is in terms of the fixed stars. It's sort of making a conjunction to a star called Astronaut, which is part of the constellation of the river Eridanus. So this is associated traditionally with sudden crises or kind of natural disasters that come on very quickly and then can very sort of quickly get out of control, like a flood or a fire. So not that I'm wishing that on anybody, but just something to be aware of. And the idea is to react quickly so that things don't sort of get out of control. So that is, I think, kind of it. As I say, if you are interested in my written forecast for this particular event, go and check out my website, where you can sort of sign up and get access to the membership area of my website. But otherwise, I'm wishing you a wonderful 2 weeks, and I'll catch you again for my forecast at the new moon solar eclipse at the solstice, which will then take us through to for the next 6 months.